All right. Well, there are so many things this morning that I look at in the way that the Lord seems to have designed the service. We've got baptism, we've got the missions emphasis, and even the presentation of the different ministries that we have. And they all fit and they all come around purpose. And that's what we're talking about here today. When we look at the doctrine of man, or Doctrina de Homine, it's talking about the doctrine of man, the purpose for which we are made. And that's what we see even in some of these scriptures that we'll be talking about and a few others that we'll share as well. And the whole theme of this morning is that God is that creator. When we ask who is the one who made us so specially, who formed us in the womb, God is that creator. Well, last week we focused on what God knows, and that's his omniscience. The transition to today's focus on the doctrine of man can be summarized with this quotation. It's not just that God knows everything, he knows me. It's not just that God is everywhere, he is everywhere with me. It's not just that God created everything, he created me. When I was in high school, I was introduced to Ultimate Frisbee when I was at Campus Life, Youth for Christ. It was our activity that we did together, whether you were really good at it or really bad at it. You could still stand there in the field and play along. And so I did this. Well, I loved this. It was my specialty. It was my thing. I don't know. If the Lord ever made somebody for the purpose of playing Frisbee, that was me. Right? Now, we were actually in a tournament at one point, and our team was expected to win the whole thing. You know, it was really exciting to go into this and just breeze right through, right? Well, the other opponents seemed to have other ideas about this. They didn't think that we should just breeze right through. Our first game, or not our first game, one of the games, we were ahead, 6-0. I mean, that's a solid lead, right? One by one. And then they scored 7 unanswered points. 7 points without us responding at all. And in fact, I missed the block that allowed them to score that 7th point. I was so mad. I was so mad as I'm scraping myself up off the grass that I punched the ground as I got up. I was so mad. Well, the ground didn't care. That's what I found out. The ground didn't move at all. On the other hand, when I looked at my hands, I noticed the bones in my hand did move. And in fact, they nearly moved outside of my hand. That's how bad it was. And at 2 different times, I turned back. Can I play with just my left hand? No, come on, I've got a broken hand. But maybe I can. And I love Frisbee that much, I was almost ready to go back in and play with a broken hand, just winged like that. When I looked at my hand, I astutely observed that the earth didn't care if I hit it or not. And that introduces what I'm going to call 4 causes. Actually, I didn't come up with this. Aristotle did. This goes way back to Greek philosophy. There are 4 causes of anything that's created. Are you saying that you're not getting any sound? Let's try it again. No? Hey. Oh. I use this story to share with you the 4 causes of philosophy that go all the way back to Aristotle. As he looked at all of the objects and tools, he considered these 4 causes. Let me point out that confusing these 4 causes, for instance, a human hand with something else, like a sledgehammer, is not advisable. Let me illustrate. The first cause is the material cause. The material cause is the stuff that something is made of. So, I mentioned a sledgehammer. What is a sledgehammer made out of? Iron, which has been heated with oxygen to make it steel. Hardened steel, in fact. And you can see where there might be problems if you confuse a human hand with a steel sledgehammer. So I don't advise discovering this on your own. You can just take my word for it. I urge you to trust me in this. I've had experience with it. The second cause is the efficient cause. And this is the most immediate thing that makes the object that we're talking about. For instance, if someone sets about making a sledgehammer, she might use an extremely hot furnace in order to heat that ingot, that bar of iron, up to 2,000 degrees, and then use a cold steel forge to slam down on that thing and make it into a hardened steel sledgehammer. All right? That's not what my mom did with my hand. When she made my hand, it was a different process entirely. A red-hot ingot with a forge, a drop forge, it's probably overkill if you're trying to make a human hand. So my mom didn't do this. She is not a sledgehammer. And I can say, see, Mom, I did learn a few things. You are not a sledgehammer. These are a few lessons that I learned. The next cause, though, as we look at this, is the formal cause. The formal cause is the form in which something does what it's supposed to do. So, for example, a paper cup has a particular form, a particular shape, that makes it especially good at holding a certain amount of liquid and dispensing that liquid into someone's mouth. A sledgehammer does not have that form. In fact, sledgehammers are very bad at holding liquid, and they're very, very bad at dispensing that liquid into someone's mouth. So don't use a sledgehammer to drink your fruit juice after the service here today. So you can see that forms have purpose. They have function that are tied to them. When we look at even our own form, it has a purpose. God made, for example, a human hand. It lacks the basic form of a sledgehammer. So it is a really inefficient way of compacting the earth. I don't recommend it again. It's not that you can't do it, but trust me, it's not the most efficient form. Finally, the last is called the final cause because it's the final cause. It is the purpose for which this material is put together into the form that it's in. 10,000 years ago, Pastor John could have taken a sledgehammer to ancient Egyptians and they might have thought, oh, is this bread? And they might have tried to take a bite out of it. That's not what it's for. And John would have said, no, that's not what it's for. It has an intended purpose that it's made for. I am here to testify that human hands are not created with the formal cause of a fist fight with the state of Wisconsin. That's the bottom line. So when we look at Psalm 139, there are a number of things that we can see out of these causes that we can benefit from. It says this, O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all of my ways. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. To the astute observer, it should be clear that I was made for a different purpose than pounding dirt in anger. That's not what God made me for. In fact, I was intricately woven for a purpose. Before my substance had formed, I as a human who was created to glorify God. That brings us to our second point today. By the way, it is going to be a compressed sermon today, considering that all the different things that we had today. But nonetheless, I hope there will be some meat again that you can take away, as I challenged you even at the first, and when we first started this, to ask you out of every sermon that we go through in this service, to take something away so that you could tell one person. That's all I want, is just to tell one person some truth that you gathered from this here today. Well, here's one of those truths. It's the teleological argument. That's a big, long word, right? But many of you might know, especially the men that were on the retreat, that I've written a whole book about this specifically. The integral life, complete passion and purpose for God. I also preached a summary of this after all the gentlemen came back from the men's retreat. You all heard a quick summary of this in September. But this is the purpose that we have been created for. It is the end result, the teleological result. Telos is the Greek word for end or purpose. You can understand this and you naturally get it from when you think about telescopes. What is a telescope? Well, the scope part is to see. And what do you see to? The end. You see to the end. And you look to that purpose or that end, that final cause that something is made for. That's what teleological is. When we think about the end, the purpose, that's what we can gather out of this. Without a telos, every human is just a mash of organic chemistry. And it doesn't matter whether that mash of carbon and hydrogen is squashed in a car accident or gets married on a very special wedding day. If there is no purpose, it doesn't matter what happens to that mash of organic chemistry. Last week, we looked at a valid syllogism regarding the moral argument. That is a logical argument that you can take home, that you can take to the bank, that shows that God created us. Because we see it in morality. All of us have built into us the knowledge of right and wrong. And that shows us that there must be an ultimate good. That's the definition of who God is. Well, this week, when we look at the teleological argument, we have another syllogism, a big, long word, but it's just a proof that God exists. Here it is. Specified complexity comes from an intelligent cause. Specified means that it has a purpose. It's made for something. Complexity means that it has multiple parts. Each of us has multiple parts. We have lots of complexity that brings us together, and it is for a particular purpose. The second thing is, we observe specified complexity in the universe. We can observe it in many different things, specifically in you and in me. We can see that purpose that we have, that there is complexity that's there. And finally, therefore, the universe must have an intelligent cause. That means that there's something outside the universe that made it the way it is for the purpose that creator wanted. Claude Shannon from Bell Labs developed an information theory based on this idea of specified complexity. That means complexity that is for a purpose. And he said this. For example, crystals are specified but not complex, having only a simple message repeated over and over and over. You can watch this with sugar crystals or all of these things. They all look the same over and over and over. They have that message of that what's being communicated, but there's not really a purpose to it. Random polymers, on the other hand, are complex, but not specified, carrying no real message at all. Only life is both specified and complex. Now get that. Only life has both purpose and complexity. Look at it this way. In 1510, a man named Peter Henlein made the first clock in Nuremberg, Germany. It actually lost several hours of time every day, so he'd have to reset it every day. I mean, it wasn't all that efficient. But think of when he makes this, and he takes it to his friend Franz, and Franz says, "Cool, a new sledgehammer." And he's just about to smash something with it. No, that's not what it's for. The purpose for it is to tell how many hours have passed through the day. When it's 10 o'clock, Franz is like, "Oh, that's amazing. Why didn't you tell me that at first?" He's about to smash it, but no, a clock can't make a clock. Okay, that's an important thing. A clock cannot make a clock. There has to be something outside of the system of that clock in order to make a clock. So obviously the clock necessitates a clockmaker. It has intention, it has meaning, it has purpose. In short, it has specified complexity. A clock requires a clockmaker. So you can see that specified complexity shows the necessity of an intelligent being that has created that object for its specified complexity, its purpose. It's just what we read, right? For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was not one of them. You were made with specified complexity. You were created with a purpose, with an end and goal in mind. The Westminster Shorter Catechism says it this way. It asks, as a catechism does, different questions about all of the universe and the theology related to it. And it asks this question: what is the chief end of man? Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. That's what you were created for. Now, we can ask a further question, maybe of the Westminster Catechism. Well, how do we glorify God and enjoy Him forever? And that's where I would bring in this book called The Integral Life, Complete Passion and Purpose for God. And I would show you that from Genesis, from the very first chapter of the Bible, we have a purpose that is specified for us. And it is this: be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over it, care for it, and maintain it. Those 7 things. And in that we find that all of our expressions in our jobs or in our family relationships, in our civic relationships and in our communities, in our marriages, in our families fathering and mothering our children, all of those things are wrapped up with these 7 purposes in mind. That is what God made us for. That's how we enjoy God forever. That's how we bring Him glory. It has always been this way since the creation of Adam and Eve. Well, that brings us to a term that if you're anywhere in the sciences, you've heard of this term, I'm sure. It's irreducible complexity. And so now we've looked at how complexity, specified complexity, the purpose for which we're made, how that shows that there has to be a maker, a designer, a clock maker. Okay? Now we can look at this irreducible complexity and we can ask ourselves, well, what if we take away one of those pieces? What if we take away a portion of that complexity? What are we left with then? And the fact is, we're left with something that loses out on the very character, the very essence of what that thing is. Let me give you an example. Now, we look at one perspective, and we looked at one perspective, that was the teleological argument, but now we look at irreducible complexity. Any complex thing with multiple parts that are essential to its essence cannot have evolved to create those parts. That's a mouthful, I admit. So, I want to show you a bacterial flagellum. That's what this is that you'll see on the screen there. And you see all of the different parts. It has a motor at the bottom. It has a rotor that's part of it. It has a tail, or you could say that's a propeller. This thing has multiple parts. The funny thing is, if you take any one of those parts away, the whole thing collapses. It is no longer a bacterial flagellum. It can do nothing. Okay? And that's pretty important, but you can say, oh, what do I care about bacterial flagellum? I'm gonna let the scientists take over here just to explain a little bit of.
The bacterial flagellum was one of the central examples of irreducible complexity Behe highlighted in his book.
If you take away the propeller, if you take away the motor, if you take away the clamps that hold it onto the cell's membrane, take away any of a number of different parts, it's not that the flagellum is going to spin half as fast as it used to, or it's broken. It doesn't work at all. It's like taking the propeller off of an outboard motor on your boat and wondering how far now you can go in the water. You can't go anywhere. So that's a problem for Darwin's theory, because Darwin's theory says that things evolve by working a little bit, maybe not very well, but a little bit, and then mutation or change comes along that helps it work a little bit better, and that helps the organism survive and have more offspring, and so then another change comes along, and another, and gradually builds up to the final structure. Well, that might work for some things, but it doesn't work for systems that are irreducibly complex, things like the bacterial flagellum. Because, well, if you wanted to build an outboard motor for a boat, what would you start with? Would you start with, say, just an iron rod that, in the future would attach a motor to the propeller? Well, what's that going to do? It's not going to do anything. When you start with just the propeller, well, that's not going to do anything. It's not attached to anything. When you start with just the motor, well, that's not going to propel you anywhere. So, with irreducibly complex systems like the flagellum, Darwin's idea is dead in the water, like a boat with an outboard motor that doesn't work.
Natural selection selects or favors in variations that confer a functional advantage on a system. Many of the simpler versions that you could imagine of the bacterial flagellum motor perform no function at all. So if you imagine trying to build a flagellum motor, adding parts one by one until you finally get to the complete system, you're going to encounter configurations of parts that confer no function, in which the motor simply will not work.
All right, let's stop there, and I'll just carry on here a little bit to share that before you get weirded out by us talking about bacteria and things, understand that not every bacterium is salmonella or E. coli or something. They're not all bad. They're not all out to get you. In fact, picture a nice creamy spoonful of yogurt. That's all bacteria that's there. That's what made that yogurt. We don't like to think of it that way, but without these flagella, which are the motors, the things that move them around, that allow something to culture, something to grow, you wouldn't have any bacteria. In other words, the good bacteria, the bad bacteria, you wouldn't have any of them. Life, as we know it, our own bodies, the very bacteria that we're dependent on in our gut, in order to process our food, we wouldn't have it. There can be no life without this irreducibly complex system. In fact, there's another very good bacteria that produces cheese. I mean, without bacteria, we wouldn't have the state of Wisconsin. Keep that in mind. So there are other examples of these irreducibly complex things. One thing I like to point out as a linguist is that there's there's an irreducibly complex system that is in the meaning of language, the order of language, and the ability to produce and to hear the language, phonology. In other words, you can't have any of these three evolve over time. They all three had to be there at the same time. If I know what a lion is, and I know what man is, and some, caveman says, lion, eat, man. Well, without knowing syntax, do I know whether the lion is eating the man or the man is eating the lion? In other words, are you telling me to run for my life or come to dinner? That's the difference there. Okay? So even in the language that we have, it is irreducibly complex. That shows that God made us to be communicating beings. He made us for relationship with him. God is that creator. As we finish up, take a look at this video from Francis Collins, director of the Human Genome Project. And we'll finish
One
with
of
this.
the greatest scientists of our time was director of the Human Genome Project, mapping the 3 billion letters in the human DNA, considered by many to be the most significant scientific undertaking of our time. He describes how he encountered Jesus of Christianity.
Well, in the home where I grew up, faith was not something that was talked about very much. My father was a professor of drama, my mother a playwright. When I went to college and those discussions in the dorm late at night about religion began to occur, I had no particular reason to attach value to a faith system. It had never been something I was familiar with or had internalized at all. And I assumed that any religious feelings that anyone held must be on the basis of some emotional experience, and I didn't trust those, or on the basis of some childhood indoctrination, which I felt I was fortunate to have missed. I loved the experience of learning about the human body and all of the components of that, and I particularly loved being introduced to genetics. But then I ended up in the medical school curriculum, sitting at the bedside of patients with diseases. This was no longer an abstract study of molecules and organ systems. These were real people. And one afternoon, one of my patients, a wonderful elderly woman, much like a grandmother, who had very bad heart disease. She had a particularly bad episode of chest pain while I was with her. She got through it, and at the end of that, explained to me how her faith was the thing that helped her in that situation. She realized that the doctors around her weren't really giving her that much help, but her faith was. And after she finished her own very personal description of that faith, she turned to me, and I had been silent. And she looked at me quizzically, and she said, "What do you believe, doctor?" And ultimately, I had to admit to myself that her question had made me realize that I had arrived at an answer to the most important issue that we humans ever deal with. Is there a God? And I had arrived there without ever really looking at the evidence. And I was supposed to be a scientist. If there's one thing scientists claim they do is to arrive at conclusions based upon evidence. And I hadn't taken the trouble to do that. I was greatly assisted by a pastor who lived down the road, who I went and asked about all this, and who gave me a copy of C.S. Lewis's wonderful book, Mere Christianity. Because here was an Oxford scholar, a prodigiously developed intellect, who had traveled the same path. Within those pages, I realized for the first time that one can come to belief on a rational basis, and that in fact, given the many pointers that one sees around oneself in terms of the universe and it having a beginning, and its fine-tuning in terms of the way in which all those constants that determine the behavior of matter and energy seem to have been set just in a certain very precise range to make life possible. And many other things, including my beloved mathematics and why they actually work anyway to describe the universe, something that makes you think the creator must have been a mathematician. That brought me then to the person of Jesus Christ as a person who was historically extremely well documented. That was news to me. I thought Christ was as much myth as history, and I realized after reading more about it, this was a historical figure upon which we have a great deal of evidence for his existence and his teachings, and even his rising from the dead in a literal way. That day at my patient's bedside started a journey for me. A journey that I was reluctant to begin, but I felt I needed to. A journey that I thought would result in strengthening my atheism, but to my surprise, resulted in my conversion.
Praise the Lord for that. Now, that's an example of what we show on Alpha on Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock. That is a clip from the first Alpha video that we show. Good, high-quality video with important people there that you can see. So, there is one question here this morning, but let me ask you these questions first. What are you going to do about this? And who are you going to tell us? There's something that's going to change in you about the way that you operate because you have heard about the teleological argument. In other words, that you have purpose. That the person next to you has purpose. That the homeless person on the street has purpose. Is made in the image of God, just like you. What are you going to do differently? Here's one question for today. Which parts of the Old Testament covenant are void under the New Covenant? Is it only what is not reaffirmed in the New Testament? Well, first of all, let me say, John and I spent about a half hour this week on Tuesday answering all of our questions from last week. We had so many of them that came in afterward that we had to answer those. And those are available on Twitter, but it's also linked from our website. So if you're interested in each week hearing about those questions and what those answers are, that's a place that you can find them. That's a place you can go to and direct other people to answer these questions. It hits the nail on the head that anything that's reaffirmed in the New Testament is something that we definitely live by. That was all for believers in the New Testament. Believers in Jesus. Not Jews, but believers in Jesus. They could be Jews that came to faith in Jesus, like Peter, like John, and so on. But that's a first step. And the other thing is, I would be careful about saying the Old Testament is void. Rather, I use the word fulfilled. Jesus fulfilled all of the prophecies that were related to the Messiah, taking away the sin of the world. And so Jesus does that. So yes, certainly the New Testament is our main guide for discerning which things are permissible and which things are not permissible.